My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, welcome back, folks, to another home team episode of Diplomatic Immunity. Today, Tristan and I will read out what happened last week at the Munich Security Conference and talk about a couple other things. But first of all, Tristan, it's good to see you as always. How are things going?
Yeah, really, really well. I'm just back from meetings in London for the Oxbridge Diplomatic Academy. So on the one hand, you get me profoundly jet lagged, but feeling good. It was a really, really useful couple of days. We've just done our first round of admissions for this coming year's summer academy, and just some amazing, amazing participants coming to the academy. To that end, if anybody out there is thinking of participating this year, please apply soon because we're going to be full up. And otherwise, all is well. I guess having been back in Europe last week, I got a reminder of what winter is like, or at least a taste of it.
Yeah.
Turns out I don't miss it. And now it's it would be cruel for me to, as always, report that it is in the mid-20s and sunny and beautiful, and there is no
Yeah,
winter
well,
blizzard.
we barely got nicked, thankfully. My kids did have another snow day yesterday, though. But I just saw in the forecast that we're expected maybe going to get another bash of snow early next week. So I don't think my kids are going to see a full week of school in 2025 or 2026. So we'll see what happens here. But
Well,
yeah,
before then, I
there's
guess we should talk about
there's
international
stuff going
affairs.
on in the world, and that might be a little bit more important than that. Don't tell the folks in Vienna Little League I said that. So we've had a couple of big meetings in the past week and a half or so, and we're going to talk about the first meeting of the Board of Peace that took place in Washington. But first, we're going to start in Munich, and from February 13th through the 15th, some major players and foreign ministries and business people and all this kind of stuff met in southern Germany. And if you guys recall, a year ago, this is where Vice President Vance, pretty newly inaugurated, came and gave a pretty thunderous speech that kind of called out the Europeans on restrictions on freedoms and kind of even, categorized the Europeans as a threat to the United States and to the US and sort of Western civilization. So, Tristan, what's your readout from this year's meeting? Slightly different.
Slightly different, but resolutely downwind of last year's conference, and indeed JD Vance's really era-defining speech, and which we talked about a few months ago, having been codified in the U.S.'s national security strategy. The theme of this year's Munich Security Conference was under destruction, which is, there's no subtext there. Uh, I imagine you'll want to talk about. I certainly want to hear your thoughts on Marco
Mhm.
Rubio's speech. Vance didn't go this year; instead, it was the Secretary of State who did give a speech in a markedly different tone to that of the Vice President JD Vance, but at least in my reading of it, in substance, not substantively different. And actually, one of the big points that I wanted to discuss with you is that the the way in which the speeches at the conference have been discussed, to me anyway, seems slightly divorced from how they actually were. I mean, I note that in just about every press reporting, they said that Marco Rubio got a standing ovation. I mean, people stood up, and but not in rapturous applause like "My goodness, America is back," and European civilizational decline is no longer what the Americans are obsessed
Yeah,
about. That never happened.
yeah, you got to keep the relative
Um,
nature
yeah.
in mind. That's the point.
Yeah, and yeah, and I mean that you know how far we have traveled such that Marco Rubio's speech is like, oh, things are okay again. But in any other universe, what he was saying, how he's still talking about uh civilizational erasure in Europe, of Europe. Thing Sure, it was better, but I remain concerned. So anyways, that's Rubio, but I do wanna hear your thoughts on that. Before we talk about Rubio, there were obviously other speeches certainly worth noting. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, really doubled down on a push for EU
Mm.
autonomy from the US. Um, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer really pushed the idea of the United Kingdom being part of European defense, a more European NATO, in his words. I mean, very much in my reading anyway. It's him trying to get the United Kingdom's relationship closer to the EU without uh, saying, "Hey, Brexit really was a big mistake." Of course, we have had Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine there, just as I see it, just trying to keep Ukraine on not just on the agenda, but at the top of the agenda. We've just passed the 4 year,
It's
I can't
crazy.
believe it, 4 year anniversary of Russia's invasion. Uh, and then the opening speech by the German Chancellor, Merz, I thought was my favorite speech of the conference. I thought it was really, really good. And maybe I just don't pay enough attention to his speeches and his oratory, but I thought he was excellent. And I saw, and this is another instance where I think the reporting and the discussion after the fact doesn't quite match up with the reality of what was said. I saw in a number of press pieces that Meltz was articulating a position that was in opposition to that the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave at Davos just a few weeks ago. Meltz talks about not being able and not wanting to
Mhm.
definitively break from the United States as a partner. It is a partnership that endures. And I mean, one, Carney wasn't saying that, well, Canada's
Is
going, he never said that. And also to focus on those lines of the speech entirely misses what he was saying at the front of the speech, which was exactly in line with what Mark Carney was arguing. Mount said in no uncertain terms that international order is not being destroyed. We're not in a moment of transition. He said, and to quote him directly, it no longer
mm,
exists. And this is exactly Carney's argument. So I read then the latter portions of Meltz's speech as being sort of a counterweight to Macron rather
yeah.
than Carney. Macron's sort of all in on European autonomy, and I think Meltz is just saying, well, America is still the predominant power. America still has, is still a partner, which is, unquestionably what Carney recognizes as well. Anyway, there's my big dump of my thoughts on the speeches that really, really were significant and matter. Please, I'm desperate to hear your thoughts, and particularly on good old Marco Rubio.
Yeah, and I think we were in line on a lot of the ways we're viewing this recent meeting. But to your point, Rubio's speech, which ironically, serendipitously, however you want to say it, did fall on Valentine's Day. So he was giving some roses to the European allies. But
Oh, but
well,
with
yeah, there's you
thorns.
got to be careful. But to your point, he did say, we do not need to, and I'm quoting here, we do not need to abandon the system of international cooperation we authored, and we don't need to dismantle the global institutions of the old order that together we built. And he was, you know, talking about the fact that the United States, for most of its history was populated by Europeans and had its roots in Europe. But he also did say, referring to NATO and the UN, that these must be reformed, they must be rebuilt. And, at times, this isn't necessarily, that's not necessarily that crazy of a statement, right? Like people have been talking about reforming the United Nations
Oh,
forever. You and I would agree that we need to reform the United Nations. we would agree that we need to reform and rebuild NATO in certain aspects, and the Europeans do need to step up and do more and everything. But those kind of statements still coming on the heels of what Vance has said, what the MAGA movement has said, what Trump has said, those aren't, they're toned down, but as you note, the underlying assumptions and thought process is still the same, and that's how I view it. And it just speaks to the relative nature of the speeches, right? I mean, the fact that they got a standing ovation was because there was a little sigh of relief because it wasn't so bombastic as Vance has given and Hegseth gave and others at meetings like this.
Yeah.
So, but to your point, there was a universe called 2022 or 2016 where if
Yeah, it
somebody
wasn't
would
that
have
long
given
ago.
or speech like Rubio gave, it would have been viewed like a Vance speech, right? Because of the nature of what it was.
Yes, precisely.
I think that's what's getting lost in some of this. And I do think, on the one side, there was, again, a little room for the Europeans to breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief. But by no means is this we're out of the woods or that the US is back and everything. And I think, there's, to your point about Mertz's speech, there's a line that he gave in there that I think is extremely important and points to sort of what's happening and what's going on. And he said that there needed to be an end to Europe's quote vacation from history. And I think when you look back
Yes.
at,
Yes.
it's not like, we think about Europe and, it was in many ways the hot seat of the Cold War, right? We think of the Cold War and the battle between the East and West for 45 years of Berlin, right? And the Iron Curtain and all this kind of stuff. And, Europe was involved, but they weren't the main players, right? And they were kind of reacting to what the US was doing, what the Soviet Union was doing. And they've still been trying to find their way forward since then and haven't really put that foot forward like they have historically, prior to 1945. And I think that's going to be the big question moving forward is what role does Europe take moving forward? Do they consign themselves to that role they were playing during the Cold War and after is sort of following the lead, or do they realize that they need to do more? And there's ends of the spectrum, right? There's Macron on one end, who envisions like this EU autonomy and like massive buildups,
I mean, said,
and then there's Merz.
yeah, the EU should be a
Right.
geopolitical
And
power.
then on the other end, you've got folks like Merz, who's more like, the US is still there, right? China is still there. We can step up, but we don't necessarily need to create a system where we are a geopolitical competitor to the United States or to China
Mhm.
necessarily. So I think that's where this is at the moment. And a lot of this stuff we have talked about for decades, right? Like European autonomy, the ability of Europe to act on its own militarily, what it needs to do to build up its forces so it can do that on its own and isn't as dependent on the United States. I mean, we were dealing with this stuff in the 50s and it's every decade since then and that hasn't gone away. So it kind of gets to the point of what is actually going to happen for the Europeans to do that if they are ever going to do it. And I think now more than ever, I think we are in a period where they're going to have to make those decisions. And we're seeing that play out. And we're also seeing that they're not aligned, right? I mean, Macron and Merz and to Carney and Starmer, I mean, they're not on the same page necessarily and have different views on how to move forward and how to do that. But I think the main takeaway is that the US under the Trump administration is still the US under the Trump administration when it comes to Europe and how it deals with Europe and what it's going to do. And we are still trying to discern, as are the Europeans, what they are going to do moving forward. And can they, you know, move past the bureaucratic inertia in Europe to actually build something together to be more of a geopolitical player, even if it's not on the realm of what Macron wants, but a heavier weight in all of this. And I think that's why it's so fascinating and why we spend so much time talking about these things is because of the importance of these and what it could mean for not just the future of Europe, but for the future of the world. And
Yeah.
it was also interesting to see some potential Democratic 2028 candidates on the stage in Munich. They don't only go to New Hampshire and Iowa these days, right? They travel to Davos and they travel to Germany. Um, but AOC was there. Gavin Newsom was there. AOC not getting the best of press with her Taiwan answer. I don't know if you saw that, but
Mm,
sort of just kind of
yeah.
stumbling all over that one. I mean, that's something you would think somebody would be a little bit prepared on going to a international affairs security conference. Uh,
You would. But it's also the kind of gaffe that, one makes early on in a career and in an election cycle. And, if this had been something that was said in New Hampshire and picked up by a local paper, like it's a non-story. But, I think it's significant and fascinating to think of like the primary season as one being longer, but two being
yeah,
internationalized at such that a gaffe like this, a mistake like that that becomes a
right.
real story.
And the importance of these types of meetings because of the new relationship between the US and Europe. And again, 15 years ago, folks wouldn't have been doing this kind of stuff as often as they're doing it. All right. Because it's just like, oh, it's the Munich Security Conference. I mean, usually, the bad guy in the room is actually the bad guy in the room, and it's Vladimir Putin talking about Russia's role in the world in 2007. The good old days. Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating, and we'll see where things go from here. But also, it's interesting to something to watch coming out of this is this isn't the only big meeting for Mertz coming up in the coming weeks because he, like Starmer, like Carney, and others, is heading to Beijing within the next week or 10 days or something. So um,
That's right.
that'll be another one to watch to see what comes out of that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and indeed see what the American reaction, or not the American, excuse me, what the American president's reaction to the visit might be, given that particularly Mark Carney's meeting in Beijing was not taken
Yeah,
well
yeah,
by the
lots of
American
Chinese EVs
president.
running around Canada in the next few years. But so the other big meeting on the docket is the Board of Peace meeting. So, uh, quickly, what were your takeaways from the Board of Peace meeting?
Well, I've been thinking about it over the past couple of days, and then particularly this morning in preparation. And I was thinking about our last conversation about it, and this sort of rogues gallery of leaders. That to be a full fledged member, you have to ante up $1 billion. That Donald Trump, the person, rather than Donald Trump, the American president, is the chairman of the board
Life,
for
yeah,
life. All these things that we discussed in our last episode. And my thinking is like it hasn't evolved beyond sort of what I expressed and what we discussed then, and in that, oh yeah, okay, kind of what we analyzed. And I got that about right. What I fear, what I worry about, yeah, it's been confirmed. One of the things that we spoke about last time was uh, the possibility that the White House and the American president views this new board of peace as being a way to supplant or replace the United Nations, which was more conjectural a couple of weeks ago. But then at the board of peace, in a statement he made, he said, and I'll quote him directly as as well as one can quote him. The Board of Peace is going to almost be looking over the United Nations and making sure it runs properly, which I think is, first off, for the American president, a relatively coherent sentence. Second, I think a really fascinating and important sentence. That really betrays sort of what they're thinking about this is, I mean, first off, I don't know what the word almost is doing there. I know the American president has that tick of sort of um, throwing these words into sentences that cause ambiguity in them. But one, it does suggest that he at least sees a future for the United Nations, but a subordination of the United Nations to the Board of Peace. So is the Board of Peace sort of like a new UN Security Council, but one where permanent membership is based on how much money you give to Donald Trump rather than a UN charter? So like that's the one sort of big thing that, or new
Yeah.
piece of evidence that came out for me. What
Yeah, no, I was going to mention the same exact thing of that statement that he made about the Board of Peace and the UN. And I just think there's two different angles to this, and I think we can't lose sight of the fact that, and we mentioned this last time and talked about it, is that the Board of Peace has a legitimate reason for being, and that is to help solve the Gaza crisis and the Gaza war, make the ceasefire more sustainable, help disarm Hamas, help rebuild Gaza, put in security structures, put in governance structures. And there was a little movement on that. There was some funds raised. The U.S. put in $10 billion. Not sure where that's coming from. And some of the players that you would expect that are relevant players in this and are members of the Board of Peace, as they should be when you think about the original process of this being about Gaza, like Saudi, like UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain. I think they put in like another 7 billion for reconstruction. But there's still such a long way to go.
I think you're exactly right that the original aim of the Board of Peace, and it's noble, it's good, it's needed purpose to bring peace and indeed reconstruction to Gaza will be lost as it in the mind of the American president is this much bigger, expansive thing, and I just focus on the thing itself, right?
Right.
It just seems like mission creep from day one.
Speaking of mission creep,
Oh, very good.
moving on to our that's what I'm here. That's what I get the big bucks for. Moving on to our final topic of the day. We have to touch on this, even if only briefly, just because we may be taking a few weeks break here. But the armada slash fleets of American might has or is very close to assembling in the Persian Gulf area and the Mediterranean area, and we are coming down to decision day on whether or not the Trump administration is going to attack Iran for the second time
Mm.
within 7, 8 months. So I think the question at this point is if they do attack, which everybody kind of agrees is there's going to be something happen. And it comes down to what exactly is that something going to be? And we've got, sort of two different levels here. One is, does the administration, do some very precise strategic hits on, maybe what's left of or what's been rebuilt of air defenses in Iran or some other nuclear sites to try to entice the Iranians to make more concessions in talks that are ongoing? Or does the president go all in and
Mm.
attempt to decapitate the regime and aim strikes at the supreme leader, perhaps main portions of the IRGC and their command and control nubs? That opens up a whole nother level of attack targets and different sort of systems that the U.S. uses. But that also potentially opens a can of worms. And there's been reporting this week that General Dan Raisin Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has, I don't want to say pushed back, but at least been giving more pause to the president on doing strikes of that nature. We've seen this story before. I think he's right to do that. And there's also the potential for limited strikes and then a week later we don't have negotiations still, and then they still go forward with the other strikes. So, what are you kind of hearing about this on your end, and what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually, at two of the meetings in London last week, we touched on this, and I mean, basically, the sentiment of all the major geopolitical analysts in the room, and some very heavy hitters basically said, like, this is an incredible amount of hardware to have in place.
Mm,
Think back a few months ago, during the first strike. Uh, these assets were not in place. The bomber force was flown over
mm,
for specifically one limited mission direct from the United States. Here we've got two, I believe, two carrier
yep,
groups in place. A third. Am I right in saying a third of the U.S. Navy is now in the region? Like this is a lot of kit, which suggests like you're probably going to use it. That's
right.
one. It's a very expensive way to applying pressure in a diplomatic negotiation, which suggests that you're probably going to use this. Um, in terms of what kind of strike, and I think this is indeed the correct question. You know, a few weeks ago, at the height of the protests in Iran, the American president said, "Help is on the way," which suggested substantive support for regime change
Mhm.
and support for the protesters. I mean, you know, coming from the mouth of this American president, that turned out not to be true. Unsurprising, and no doubt devastating for those protesters who relied on the American president's word. Um, Look, hot off uh, I don't want to call it necessarily a success, but hot off the Venezuela strike, I do think the American president has a taste for a
Yeah.
decapitation strike and is able to and views that as a resounding success. So it wouldn't surprise me if the move is an attempt at a decapitation strike, and but you leave the regime in place, and I guess in my mind, it fits the Trump playbook perfectly. It's something that's big, it's flashy, it appears strong and macho. It's something that you can easily claim as a victory, but it does not address the underlying problems at all. So I guess if I were to wager on what the White House's or at least the American president's thinking is right now, which is a dangerous thing to do, I kind of see them leaning that way. I mean, to do it to actually go for regime change would require such an investment in time and troops, and
Yep.
I as much as the American president has drifted from the uh, sort of isolationist or non-interventionist America, I don't think he's drifted so far that it's like, well, it's boots on the ground time in Iran.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I don't think, sending strikes, hitting Iran with airstrikes and cruise missiles is one thing. Sending in a special forces team to grab Maduro is one thing, but an invasion force, an occupation force, thousands of American troops on the ground, I don't see that. I don't see how he can. Well, I'd be careful what I say here.
Yeah.
I don't see how he can 180-degree from everything he's ever said that far.
Yeah.
Because boots on the ground has been one of his main talking points forever. So, but to your point, we've seen this playbook before. I mean, we saw them assemble the Armada and the stick carrier strike group in the Caribbean before the Venezuela action, and we're seeing that again. I mean, there is on one level, you know, he could be using this as a negotiating tool. You've seen this before. You saw what I do, so you better come to the table, and that's it. But I don't think this ends with nothing.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're at the level of decapitation strikes. I do think there will be some level of strikes in the coming days or weeks. Um, to try to get them to do something more on the nuclear portfolio. But, and man, am I hedging all over the place. I do think though that for somebody like this president, Iran and the Iranian regime is the white elephant, the unicorn that's out there. If you were the president to end the Iranian regime and that threat to Israel, the Middle East, the US, like that's that unicorn that's out there. And if he you got to think that he thinks about that, about being the president that ends this almost 50-year death to America conflict between the US and Iran. And now's the time to do it, right? I mean, they don't have nuclear weapons.
Iran has
They've
never been weaker.
right, right. Since since the end of the Iran-Iraq War, basically, and they've already been degraded because of their proxies have been degraded, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or groups in Syria with the fall of the Assad regime. We've already seen that their air defenses have been decimated by the Israelis and us last summer. It is, not that I'm justifying this, but it is as opportune a moment as you're going to get to do something like this, which also lends me to believe that he's going to do something. So we will see in the days ahead. But I wouldn't be surprised at all, and I would say I would put money on the fact that the next time we meet, we are probably going to be talking about the recent U.S. strike on Iran.
Yeah. Yeah. It does seem more likely than not.
Yes. But anyways, to wrap things up on that cheerful note,
As always.
it's yes, yeah, we got to find some happier stories to talk about. I guess that's just on us, but there's some because there are good things going on in the world. But we need to highlight those a little bit more, I think, but just to make us feel better. And all of you guys listening, you folks listening. So, but anyways, good to see you as always, man.
Likewise.
And I'll see you in a few weeks.
You bet.